One, two, get down. Get down. Two, one, two, get down.
What is the deal, beautiful people? My name is Ramon. Welcome to the channel. Here we talk about any and everything photography. Today's topic is how I personally build my exposure, and I hope that we can use this as a baseline and continue the conversation in the comments below, because we all have different ways we use to attack the art of photography. When talking about building exposure, this took me, I don't know, this took me a few years to really get a rhythm and understand how to actually do it. And there are very few key parts of this. One, it's really understanding the exposure triangle, and we're talking about the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, and how these things all work together, and who and what is interchangeable. And then two, it's making use of some very specific tools that your camera already has. I'm very guilty of ignoring the tools, one of which is the exposure meter. I don't know, it was a little daunting at first, and really it wasn't until I went back to shooting a DSLR for a bit that I started to notice the how important the exposure meter is, because in DSLRs there is no electronic viewfinder. So while you're looking through the viewfinder on a DSLR, you can't see how your settings are affecting the scene. All you're seeing is a mirror reflection of what's happening in real life. On a mirrorless camera, however, as you dial in your settings, the exposure will get lighter or darker, or you'll see your depth of field in real time. So it's kind of easy to take the exposure meter for granted in today's mirrorless world. However, the exposure meter, I think, does a great job at averaging the scene. And really what that is, if you've ever seen an exposure, and you should if you're using a camera, it's that meter on the bottom. It's got a -2 and a +2, and in the middle there's a dot. So whatever's showing up perfectly in the middle would ideally be a perfectly exposed image. And I think it's a wonderful tool to keep you at or at least to get you to a well-balanced image at first. Whether you wanna expose to the right or expose to the left, and people do this for various reasons, protecting highlights or increasing dynamic range, it doesn't matter, but at least you have your starting point. Then you can go after that advanced technique. So for me, everything that I've done has been keeping an eye on the exposure meter and trying to get it as dead center as possible. I'll usually set my cameras, actually I always set my cameras to auto ISO. So this is the very first piece. I don't generally care about ISO. So my Olympus cameras, which are prone to noise, my auto ISO is set from low, which is, I guess it's 200, or maybe you can go a little lower. I have it set, the lowest is 200, and the highest I go is 1600. So what that does is the camera will use anything in between, but it will never go lower or higher than those two values. And 1600 is okay for me because I've since learned how to get rid of noise in an Olympus camera. So if it's a low light portrait, I do know how to get rid of the noise. These days I don't really care much about noise, because the noise in these digital cameras, the newer versions, I'm talking anything in the last like 6 or 7 years, they don't look like the jarring digital noise you think they do. You know, they look kind of pleasing, and some of them mimic film grain, especially like the Fuji. The noise is quite decent. So I've been okay with noise, but nonetheless, I don't want to continue to choose an ISO myself and play that game with the exposure triangle. I'll let the camera handle that. The second thing I do is my shutter speed. Actually, I'm sorry. The second thing I do is my aperture. The aperture really is the most important decision, for me at least, when building a composition or an exposure. The decision is, do I want to include the entire scene, or do I want subject separation, right? And that's directly tied to the depth of field. So if I want to include the entire scene, and this is usually what you do for landscape photography and also to some extent street photography. So you're usually at like an f8 and up, f11, anywhere in that range, f16 if you're shooting sunny 16. You can do some street stuff like that. Landscape guys I know go up as high as f16. If you want to do like some subject separation, you're talking about having a person in the shot stand out a lot more than the background. So you have the background really blurred and creating some depth of field. You'd usually be at like anywhere from f5.6 all the way up until like f1.8 if your camera supports, if your lens, supports it. Then comes the third and final piece of the puzzle. That's your shutter speed. The shutter speed is, it's usually the decision you make around motion or no motion. And of course, if you want to freeze motion, you got to get up there and in the, somewhere around 1/8,000th of a second, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000. Any of that can freeze your motion. If you want to show motion, then you're probably coming back down to like 1/30th or 1/10th of a second. Any of those, or even a second exposure, I've done it at night and street, and that can give you some really cool looks. But mostly for me, shutter speed is what I use to control the overall exposure and how much light will be coming into the camera. So you'll find that in a landscape scene, to control or even out the exposure, remember keeping an eye on the exposure meter, you're going to want to come down to like a second, 2 seconds, whatever it is. And I'm thinking because I do a lot of my landscape, cityscape stuff at night, so that's usually where I'll play. For me personally, the shutter speed is usually just a tool that I will adjust, and watching that exposure meter, it'll either bring my image back to the left or back to the right and very much center. But I'm usually not done there. So after I find the perfect, if I find the perfect zero exposure and everything looks nice in the image, I'll circle back to attack the ISO. What's important to know here, and certain cameras do it differently. What I like about the Olympus is as you're making that exposure, it'll give you an actual ISO, because remember I'm running auto ISO. As I start to mess with the shutter speed and keeping that dial in the middle, it'll sort of say, okay, I've chosen ISO 1600 for this image. And that may be okay, right? Like I said, noise is not a big deal, but what if I could get it cleaner? There are very real instances where if I continue to dial in the shutter speed, you'll start to see the ISO number drop. So it's about that sweet range of how do you balance out the exposure you want, sure, with the shutter, but then also continue to push that direction to bring the ISO down without ruining your exposure. I hope this all makes sense. Maybe you'll need to watch the video a few more times to have it really click. But personally, this is how I build exposures. And I know there are a million different ways to attack this very same scenario. And that gets even more vast when you take into account the different types of photography and the different decisions you make to execute your vision. I'd like to hear from you guys in the comment section down below. I always like the open interaction, because not only am I learning from you guys are learning from me, and somebody out there searching for this video, they can learn from us all. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Plenty more content coming. My name is Ramon. I'm out of here. Peace.